Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the final event of the semester for the Brazil Initiative. It's called Brazil What's Next. We're having a roundtable discussion on the current political situation in Brazil. But considering the fact there may be people in the audience who don't have full context for impeachment proceedings against Dilma Rousseff, President Dilma Rousseff, we're going to just show a clip of an interview with Glenn Greenwald, about 9 minutes, about the impeachment proceedings, and then we'll move on from there.
America's biggest economy. It's the continent's most powerful country, one that thought it was rid of a history of violent military coups. But now, Brazil's democratically elected president Dilma Rousseff says that she's the victim of a political coup after Congress Sunday night voted overwhelmingly to send impeachment proceedings against her to the Senate. Dilma's supporters reacted to the vote with shock and sadness, while her enemies and anti-government protesters celebrated. But what has she done? Presided over the worst recession in nearly a century, allegedly used creative accounting to conceal the hole in her budget, tried to hire her predecessor, perhaps to shield him from criminal investigation. But are these impeachable offenses? She herself has not been tainted by or even accused of corruption, and she refuses to resign.
Those who call me to resign show the fragility of their conviction of the process of impeachment, because above all, they are trying to instate a coup d'etat against our democracy. I can assure you that I will not cooperate with this. I will not resign for any reason whatsoever.
So, what is at the core of this political drama that's led to anger and frustration online and on the streets? Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Glenn Greenwald lives in Brazil, and he's closely covering this constitutional crisis. He joined me from Rio. Welcome back to the program, Glenn.
Great to be with you.
So were you surprised? Did anybody really think that at the last moment she could have got the votes she needed to stave off this sort of impeachment process?
I don't think the outcome was particularly surprising. I think that the margin was fairly surprising, although Brazilian politics, like in a lot of other countries, is about momentum and power. And once there was a perception that they had the votes, a lot of last-minute undecided switch to the pro-impeachment side so that they can be on the winning side. I think what did surprise people, though, was the tenor of the proceedings in the House. It was extremely raucous, very ugly. You had pro-impeachment advocates standing up and hailing the 1964 coup and the right-wing military dictatorship that followed. One prominent right-wing congressman who's expected to run for president specifically praised the chief torturer of the military regime, who, of course, tortured Dilma Rousseff, the president, before then voting to impeach her. So it kind of was a very polarized and a very ugly tenor to these proceedings that reflects this wider sentiment in Brazil that really has split the country in a very dangerous and unstable way.
Even the vice president, who may have to step in, is himself accused of all sorts of misconduct and wrongdoing. And I just want to read this to you because it is extraordinary. Of the 594 Congress members, 352 face accusations of criminal wrongdoing, according to multiple reports. And then, of course, there are all sorts of people, including Eduardo Cunha, who's leading the impeachment process, who's accused of perjury and corruption. You've got another one, Maluf, who's on Interpol's red list for conspiracy. You've got another one accused of money laundering. You've got another one, as you just mentioned, you know, who is sort of implicated in all sorts of torture, and others, you know, implicated in human rights violations. Now, Dilma herself has called this a coup. What is going on?
It's the most extraordinary thing, Christiane, because not only is essentially the entire Brazilian political class that is trying to impeach her implicated in really serious corruption. I mean, the most surreal thing I have ever seen in my time as a journalist or anywhere else covering politics in countries was that yesterday, the person presiding over the impeachment proceeding in the House, the Speaker of the House, Eduardo Cunha, whom you referenced, he is somebody who was found to have stashed away millions of dollars in bribes. There's no non-corrupt possibility. He has no wealth. He has no businesses. Millions of dollars stashed away in Swiss bank accounts. He's somebody who's presiding over the House as they're all getting up one by one, all of them accused of corruption and saying, we must remove the president for corruption. And amazingly, Dilma herself is one of the few people not accused of any kind of bribery or personal corruption or kickbacks or anything to be enriched. What's going on is pretty simple. Her party, the Workers' Party, or the PT, has won 4 straight national elections, going all the way back to Lula, who was wildly popular, who was first elected in 2006 and then reelected in 2002 and then reelected in 2006. The plutocrats in Brazil, the rich in Brazil, have long hated PT, have not been able to defeat them at the ballot box. And so this is their big chance with the economy tanking, with this crisis proliferating, with people really upset with the government and the political class. This is their big chance to finally get rid of PT, which they cannot win in an election. And so they're using these anti-democratic means to do it. And it's incredibly blatant what's taking place.
Do you think, because even her supporters, certainly abroad, believe that when she tried to hire Lula, her predecessor, as chief of staff, they thought this was a step too far, that she was trying to shield him from any criminal probes and obviously help her in some way? Some have said that she should resign, even though she may not be impeachable, or these things that she's accused of don't rise to the level of impeachable offenses. Do you think that she should resign? Will she be forced to resign?
I don't think no, I don't think she will be forced to resign. She's been very clear that she won't. This is a woman who was put into prison as a dissident during the dictatorship and who was tortured. She's a very strong and willful woman who has been through a lot in her life. And remember, the election in Brazil was only 18 months ago. It was at the end of 2014. She won that election with 54 million votes. It is true that she's unpopular. She's made a lot of missteps. That effort to get Lula into the government, which is really a last-minute survival tactic by her to get somebody with incredible political charisma and a lot of political skill that she lacks, Lula, into government to try and save her, didn't have a very good look. But at the same time, you cannot go around, if you want to have a mature democracy, a mature, stable democracy, and remove democratically elected leaders who just won a major election 18 months earlier because they're unpopular or because they're not managing the economy well. That is a recipe for some really dangerous things when you start tinkering with the mechanics of democracy, especially in a country like Brazil, which has a very fragile and a very young democracy. They came out of dictatorship only in 1985. And it's really disturbing to watch them trifling with democracy this way.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've talked about how the whole system is full of political scandals and corruption. And you've also admitted that her party is sort of deeply corrupt and awash in its own sort of, you know, criminal wrongdoings, even though she's not touched. So I wonder, you know, what's the way out of that? But particularly in light of what this professor at the Sao Paulo University has told the New York Times about what's going on now. It's putting a very large bullet in Brazilian democracy, he says. From now on, any moment that we have a highly unpopular president, there'll be pressure to start an impeachment process.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I interviewed the former president, Lula, last week in Sao Paulo. And he admitted 2 things to me in that interview. He said, number one, it is true that his party, the PT party, which is Dilma's party as well, has a very serious problem with corruption, just like most of the other parties. And that number 2, there's this major investigation that's called Lava Jato, or car wash in English, in which these really aggressive young prosecutors have asserted judicial independence and have been aggressively putting people in prison, the richest people in Brazil, the most politically powerful people in Brazil. The solution is to let that investigation unfold and let the people who are guilty be put in prison. The concern is that their intention with impeaching Dilma is to say to the country, look, we got rid of the corruption problem. The media pressure, the public pressure, they hope will dissipate now that there's this catharsis over impeachment, and that this investigation will end and all of these truly corrupt politicians will be protected. So the solution, to answer your question, is to let this investigation unfold, take everybody who's corrupt in all of the opposition parties and in PT, of which there are many, and subject them to the rule of law and to accountability and put them in prison, as was going to happen prior to the impeachment of Dilma.
An incredible story. Glenn Greenwald, thanks for joining us from Rio de Janeiro tonight.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's not the only perspective, but he's a very important journalist talking about Brazil, and I would like to now introduce the moderator of our roundtable, Jerry Augusto. Jerry Augusto is the Gerard Visiting Associate Professor of International Public Affairs and Africana Studies, a Watson Institute Faculty Fellow, and Faculty Associate at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, as well as an affiliate of the Science and Society program. She's a member of Brown's Brazil Initiative and a Fulbright Scholar. She also collaborates with the Steve Biko Institute in Salvador da Bahia. Could you please welcome Jerry Augusto?
Let me say a few words first. Okay. Good evening. In some important ways, what is transpiring right now in Brazil is about, as one historian recently encapsulated in her book, the terms of inclusion. Naturally, others see the conjuncture differently, and both our panel tonight and you, the audience, will help us explore these perspectives together, if not necessarily in agreement, together. In fact, one of the main parts of the mission of the Brazil Initiative here at Brown is to generate an understanding of Brazil that is more diverse, more complex, and more nuanced. Like some of you, I've been following not just the news formulated by those 5 or 6 powerful media conglomerates in Brazil, or even CNN and Al Jazeera, but also via a steady stream of articles, opinion pieces, news straight from the streets and from particular communities, Twitter, Facebook, and even images sent to me by people in Brazil. I wanted to show just a few of those images. You may find them controversial. I'm not going to say absolutely anything about them. I'm just going to show them. And that will be my contribution to the debate that is sure to follow our panelists. So I'll show the images, and then I'll introduce the panelists. Are they there? I'll give time for people who actually read Portuguese to read them, but I'm not going to say anything. Okay, and now for our panelists, and I'd like them to come up. I get to do this. I love this. They do it in Brazil all the time. You get people to come up and you can welcome them. So, Renan Quinalha, please come forward, is a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of São Paulo and visiting research fellow at Brown. He has worked as a lawyer at the Truth Commission of São Paulo and has written extensively on transitional justice in Brazil, including his book entitled Justiça de Transição, Contornos do Conceito, and co-edited with James Green, our own Professor Green, the director of the Brazilian Initiative here at Brown, the book Ditadura e Homossexualidades, Repressão, Resistência e a Busca da Verdade. Edilza Sotero received her PhD in sociology from the University of São Paulo in July 2015. Presently, she's a visiting scholar at Brown's Department of Africana Studies. Her current research project is entitled Sofia Campos Teixeira and Arinda Serafim, Black Women's Thought on Race, Class, and Gender in Brazil After World War II, an historical study of Black political mobilization in Brazil, focused on the intersection of race, gender, and class. She is also working on her first book, tentatively entitled Representação Política Negra no Brasil pós-Estado Novo. Dr. Sotero has published articles in journals and book chapters on topics related to affirmative action, gender and education, educational inequities, Black political representation, Black movement organization and activists, and communism and race. Andre Bogosian is currently a Master of Laws degree candidate at Harvard Law School. He graduated from the Law School of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and holds a master's degree in constitutional law from the, I'm used to seeing these in Portuguese, saying it in English, Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. In the fall of 2014, Bogosian was a visiting research fellow at Brown University in the philosophy department. We're going to start with Renan, and I'll ask each of them to speak for about 15 minutes, and we'll take it from there. Renan, you can do here or there as you like.
I think I'm gonna do from here. Good evening for everybody. First of all, I would like to thank very much Ramon and the people involved with the Brazilian Initiative for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss this theme. And I'm going to start, as we just saw Glenn Leavold talking about the Brazilian situation. We have a president elected by 54 million Brazilians, and against whom there are no charges of corruption, and she has become the target of impeachment procedure. The main reasons for her trial related to supplemental budget decrease and delays in federal fund transfers to public banks in order to maintain social programs, a procedure known as pedaladas fiscais. Eduardo Cunha, the president of the Brazilian Congress, is leading this ongoing impeachment process. However, he's been accused of corruption and money laundering and may condemned for over 108 years of imprisonment. Just this week, Fernando Baiano, one of the doleiros investigated also in Lava Jato, reported delivering 4 million reais to Cunha, reinforcing these suspicions of corruption. Cunha used and still uses his power to obstruct the investigation and blackmail the government, which didn't support his defense in the Comissão de Ética, the Ethics Committee of the institution. Also, after more than 134 days, the Supreme Court still has not yet decided on the request of his removal from office, and the Comissão de Ética still has not judged him after more than 174 days. Vice President Michel Temer, who belongs to the same party as Cunha, is openly organizing a new government even before the impeachment of the current president. He already disclosed names he would nominate as ministers and projects for his new government with the probable participation of the opposition groups defeated in 2014 election. Instead of working to implement projects discussed in the elections and registered in the electoral court, out of respect to the outcome of the polls, Temer has begun to build another government program that prioritizing the pressures from the most conservative sectors of the society, such as pulling the plug on the constitutional minimums for social security and education, imposing greater restrictions on welfare policies, using the military in rural conflicts, revoking the disarmament law, approving the family law, and other projects previously shelved by popular opposition. These projects are not approved, but they are being discussed now more openly. In Brazil, the vice president is elected along with the president according to the program presented by the latter. Therefore, the vice president doesn't have his own program, especially in cases when these projects proposed by Temer go against the government program presented by Dilma in the elections. It's important to register that some business organizations have sponsored public acts of protest against the government with general support from the country's largest media companies, deepening the political crisis and attempting to make the alternative of impeachment fait accompli. This is a brief overview of the current scenario in Brazil, which can be defined as a parliamentary coup against a government that has lost its majority and lives an adverse time of economical crisis and unpopularity. The second term of Dilma government, which in fact had only just begun and in fragile state, seems to be already finished. Unfortunately, what matters least in the impeachment discussion today is the law. It's hard to me to say this as a lawyer also, but I have to assume this. Impeachment is a political trial, no doubt, but there is a legal framework that is being pushed to the background. This was made clear in the report of the rapporteur in the chamber and the pitiful justifications for votes given by members 2 weeks ago. So I'm not here to discuss whether or not pedaladas fiscais constitute a crime of liability, crime de responsabilidade, as defined in Brazilian legislation, as required by our law. This aspect, which may also be discussed by Supreme Court soon, is no longer the most important in the analysis of the current political situation. Rather, what I would like to understand is how the president, who had reached a 59 approval rating in her first term, the highest rate of a president over an entire mandate, even more than Lula, in a short period of time, lost all her political supports and now is being removed from the presidency on an impeachment conducted more by her own allies than by her opponents. Then I want to point out some moments that seem important to analyze this quick change about the government Dilma. In the Brazilian model of coalitional presidentialism, the party that elects the president can't elect a parliamentary majority on its own for its government, which necessitated a broad agreement with the other political parties. PT has not escaped this rule. In 2003, it came to power by constantly and consistently negotiating the support of several small parties at one and the same time. However, the judgment on the corruption scandal of Mensalão in 2005 made these types of political negotiations give rise to a more permanent alliance with the PMDB, and this party indicated the vice president for the 2010 election. But this model was not as well assimilated by Dilma as it was by Lula. Dilma began her first term with a house cleaning, faxina in Portuguese, in the most important levels of the federal administration in 2011. At the same time, she deposed the corrupt board of Furnas, a very important company in Brazil, and dismantled a mafia installed in the Ministry of Transportation. In a few months, 7 ministers were dismissed on corruption charges, most of them members of the allied parties. Moreover, even in the first years of Dilma government, the PT started encouraging the creation of new small parties and to invest in the internal division of the PMDB to preserve the hegemony of PT in the government. For example, it helped to create the PSD, led by Gilberto Kassab in 2011, and Cid Gomes PROS in 2013. Dilma removed Romero Jucá from the government leadership in 2012. I have a problem with 2012. Bet on Eduardo Braga against Renan Calheiros in the dispute for the presidency of the Senate, and suffered a defeat with Eduardo Cunha's election to the presidency of the chamber. she always tried to play on the internal differences of PMDB. A hard style, little dialogue, government by decrees, not getting parliamentarians to exclusive meetings are factors that increased the discontent of members of Congress with Dilma. More and more, they asked for more space, offices, and budgets to maintain fidelity to the government in the votes in Congress. The Vice President, Michel Temer, even became responsible for government police coordination. But the fundamental turning point that led to Dilma's fall from grace was not the 2014 elections, but the protests in June 2013. Starting with an agenda for better public transportation and lower fares, the mobilizations mushroomed into demands for social rights, less corruption, and more political participation. At that time, more than exclusive dissatisfaction with the government or the PT, it was against the political system and the lack of representation felt by different sectors of Brazilian society. The government didn't know how to give appropriate answers, failing to take advantage of this moment to start changing the workings of political system in Brazil after more than 12 years in power. After announcing some timid measures, the government ended up surrendering increasingly to PMDB pressures and to the political establishment, ignoring the demands of the streets and dismissing the complex protests of June 2013 as conservative. In the 2014 elections, this longing reappeared. Rousseff's campaign tried to answer these demands and manage a narrow victory precisely by trying to incorporate them. But after the victory, her second government began with very different from what was promised, ignoring electoral promises and with even less dialogue with organized civil society. The opposition questioned the results of the elections and asked for a recount. Soon after, the sharp drop in commodity prices in late 2014 and the rise in the price of electricity and gasoline in early 2015 exacerbated popular discontent with the government. The economic crisis got worse with the decline of GDP and incomes, and rising inflation and unemployment levels. Conservative fiscal adjustment measures worsened the scenario. The corruption investigations of money changers, doleiros, in Curitiba exposed a serious corruption system for financing election campaigns through Petrobras. This operation, called Lava Jato, or car wash, as referred in English by the journalist, took on a clearly anti-government character with a series of excesses and arbitrary processes that jeopardized justice and the rule of law. On March 8, 2015, was the first panelaço, the protest beating pants, when Dilma spoke on national television. On the 18th of the same month, there was the first major mass mobilization clearly against the government in the streets. The government's rate of disapproval reached 62% in 2015. Since then, panelaços and demonstrations have recurred. Public opinion, fooled by the media, by sectors of the business community, and by selective leaks of the judiciary of corruption investigations, have turned the impeachment into the great alternative to the crisis. Not to mention the resentment of the Brazilian upper classes with the social changes led by the government that has been present in much of the criticism and opposition. Between a rock and a hard place and under pressure from conservatives, Dilma continued giving even more space to PMDB in successive ministerial reforms to end with no ability to lead her own government anymore, watching her popularity collapse. This side effect of this rearrangement that at first glance seemed to ward off the threat of impeachment is clear. A government that has come undone, has surrendered to conservative forces, and thus is less able to engage and mobilize the social basis that elected it and unable to deliver what it promised in the campaign. All of this, in spite of going so far to follow the rules of the game, the Dilma and PT were unable to guarantee and sustain their power in government. The current crisis thus exposes not just a government crisis for Dilma, but its failed attempts at dialogue and bargaining, which didn't mark a change in the traditional clientelistic, lobbying, and other practices in the governance of the Brazilian state. It's clear that there is a kind of exhaustion of Lulism, the concept coined by André Singer. Lulism is a kind of weak reformism project that succeeds with the favorable international conjuncture of commodity prices at achieving a higher level of redistributive justice through a broad pact and accommodation of the most diverse and distinct sets of interests. This advanced social policy was made possible, however, through the worst clientelistic practices of the political establishment, which was how Lula neutralized many conflicts. When, in June 2013, the mobilizations challenged the political system, the government chose to preserve itself through the same system. The Dilma government crisis, in my view, is a manifestation of a broader crisis of representation of the political system, unable to respond to society's demands for more democracy and rights in order to preserve conservative approaches to governance, often through supermajorities in the House and Senate. It's no wonder that the population is sick of politicians and does not trust in political institutions. According to research conducted by Datafolha in March of this year, the percentage of the population that defends the impeachment of Rousseff and Temer is the same, 60%. The same mistrust of Congress is present in the views of the population. Thus, it is clear that the impeachment will not be any solution to the crisis in which we Brazilians live. It will only aggravate the old tradition of coups and institutional ruptures in the country against democracy and the rule of law. Brazil still struggles to give this process the name it is due and of which it is deserving. But it's already clear that, that we have had a coup at this moment. It's that. Thank you.
It's okay. Good evening, everybody. I also want to thank Ramon for the invitation and Professor Lee for agreeing to participate and moderate the debate tonight. I decided to talk about something that is very important to me, and I think that is lacking in the debate about crisis in Brazil. I decided to talk about a perspective of people living in peripheries in Brazil and how it's related with the idea of crisis, economic crisis, and political crisis. I read a text too, because I don't want to submit you to my speech. So it will help. Few days ago, the English historian Perry Anderson wrote a very interesting article about the current crisis in Brazil. In the article, Anderson said that in the past year, Brazilian streets saw more protesters than the rest of the world combined. Sometimes it's hard to understand and explain what's going on in Brazil. Many of us rely on text and images. several images became powerful symbols with the ability to quickly translate who are and what want the people mobilized in the Brazilian streets. One of the images extensively shared recently portrays a family. It is this image Professor Juris also showed to us. Going to a protest in Rio de Janeiro on a Sunday in March. Father, mother, and children was accompanied by the nanny. She all dressed in white, while the couple followed in green and yellow shirts with their dog on a leash. That image was converted into the newest symbol of the race-class divide in Brazil. Several associations were made to explain the racial and class inequalities present in the Brazilian society. Associations like this image and also this image. Many people spoke against and in favor of the nanny's presence in the protest, and especially the fact that she was wearing white clothes. The employer of the nanny captured in the picture was also heard after a note written by him and published on Facebook became widely disseminated. In all the controversy, the nanny, one of the main characters of the polemic, seems to have remained as an image, a body, hyper-visualized, but without voice. In fact, few learned that her name is Maria Angélica Lima. She is 45 years old and lives in the city of Nova Iguaçu, a working-class city nearby Rio de Janeiro. In the day after the protest, when she was found by a local newspaper, Maria Angélica said she was terrified by the backlash involving her image. She told to the reporter, "I felt exposed. I woke up and saw my face in the newspaper. It was a shock." When asked about her opinion on the political situation in Brazil, Maria Angélica showed suspicion. She said, "People want impeachment and want things to change, but it will not change. When the President Dilma goes out, the next president will keep stealing. Brazil is like this. Who has money, like the politicians, will remain okay. The people will always take the worst." When I read about Maria Angélica perception, I remember another Maria, whose trajectory caused astonishment between Brazilian elite many years ago. If we compare the images of Carolina Maria de Jesus II and Maria Angélica, we will see a markedly similar living conditions. I will not go into details, and I don't know how many of you knows about Carolina Maria de Jesus, but in few words, I can say that Carolina Maria de Jesus was someone who dreamed and dared to be an author, and in 1960, she had her first book published, Quarto de Despejo, translated to English as Shield of the Dark. In the book, Carolina analyzes the Brazilian political situation at the time, and here are some quotes. "Democracy is losing its followers. In our country, everything is weakening. The money is weak, democracy is weak, and the politicians are very weak. Everything that is weak dies one day. Who must be a leader is the person who has ability, someone with sympathy for the people. Those who govern our country are those who have money, who does not know what hunger is, or pain, or poverty. If the majority revolt, what can the minority do? I am on the side of the poor, who are unarmed, undernourished arm. We must free the country of the profiteering politicians." It is interesting to realize that no longer after Carolina wrote about the feeling of despair, hopelessness in politics, Brazil entered a long military dictatorship, which lasted 21 years. Although there is striking similarities in the position of the two Marias, Brazil of 2016 is not the same Brazil of 1960. But parallels between them reinforce the argument that historically, in terms of participation, Brazil as a society has been putting aside a portion of the population, even in periods of democracy. It is good to remember that one of the basic rights of citizenship was extended to illiterate in Brazil only in the last constitution, in 1988. It may be correct to say that the apparent indifference of the masses in politics does not mean an absence of political opinion among them, but what is lacking are spaces where their voice can be heard. Currently, much has been said in Brazil about a new collective subjectivity, which emerged as a result of a number of factors closely linked to the years of economic growth and improvements promoted by the social programs developed since 2002 by the governments of the Workers' Party. Programs like Bolsa Familia, conditional cash transfer, we had a wonderful presentation last week about that. The housing program, Minha Casa Minha Vida, the program More Physicians, Mais Médicos, and the program University for All, ProUni. In my search to identify leaders of this new collective subjectivity, I found three major arguments they use for self-definition, which are: the first, we are the majority of the population. We usually refers to people living in peripheries, poor and black people. The second argument, we now have voice in a collective sense, and we have spaces to project our voice. The third argument, we will not take any step back from what we have achieved. I also found a mobilization organized to present the perspective of people who identify themselves as part of this new collective subjectivity on the recent political developments in Brazil. In March, they released a manifesto titled Periferias contra o Golpe, Peripheries Against the Coup. Created collectively, the manifesto through social media and signed by 470 collectives, movements, networks, and civil society organizations, and more than 2,500 women and men living in peripheries claim the defense of a real democracy. First important information about this mobilization is that although there is no disagreement about the serious moment Brazil is facing, they are firm and point that the priority must be the people and not the financial system. They stand in the point of view that one cannot leave a development project which takes into account a construction of social justice by another where the priority is to solve problems in the economy. It is clearly a challenge because without a strong economy, it's hard to do any work on social justice, but their emphasis is on the idea of priority. The Manifesto Periferias contra o Golpe starts posing an important question. Peripheries, backstreets, slums, you must be wondering what we have to do with this. We, women and men, residents of the peripheries who never slept while the giant was awakening, is a sentence very used in Brazil. We are here to deliver a loud message to the fascists. We are against this new ongoing coup which impacts us directly. About the current presidential government, they say, we who do not defend the PT government, which listen to few of our real demands while align itself with our exploiters. And we continue to point out its contradictions. Still, we also refuse to walk alongside those who represent the Casa Grande. Casa Grande here in the slavery vocabulary reference to here can be translated as master house in the slavery plantation. References to the Casa Grande are frequent among people identified with the popular movements, especially with metaphors related with the access to the higher education. As we see here, the master house freaks out when the slave quarters learn to read, and some adaptation that Susan da Silva did. She's now a student of medicine in ProUni University. Another important point to be noted is that the peripheral movement is aware they can use this moment to propose a broad debate about the meanings of democracy and the same factors historically neglected. In the manifesto, for example, that idea is explicitly presented when they say, we know that real democracy will only arrive with the broadening of the rights and gains of our peripheral poor and black people, from the left and from the bottom up. The voices in the popular movements from the peripheries does not subscribe the idea that the race-class divide and its consequence deepened only in the last few years. Instead, they affirm that the Brazilian society is structurally unequal, and the fight against inequalities must be the base of the fight for a real democracy. The peripheral voices claim the constant violence inflicted against them need to be understood as a serious crisis in the same way as the political and economic crisis. Here. So if the goal is something that yes, I did. If the goal is to strengthen democracy and citizenship, it's necessary to face the problem of endemic violence as a factor which endangers democracy in the same way. About the violence in Brazil, just three quickly data. The prison population in Brazil increased 270% in the last 14 years. Brazilian military police has the highest death rate in the world. Police officers kill an average of 6 people every day in Brazil, and the murder victims are mostly young black male living in the peripheries. In face of this situation, what could explain the opposition in several popular movements in Brazil to the impeachment against the President Dilma Rousseff? I found a major argument that the impeachment is devoid of any legal grounds, being politically and legally wrong. It's because they are referring to it as a coup. They say in the manifesto, for example, we have achieved only some of our dreams and the rights we are entitled. We refuse to retreat. We demand respect for the sovereignty of the vote and the preservation of democratic rule of law. We demand the streets as a space of dialogue, debate, and political action, but never as a place for hate. We demand our freedom of speech, be it ideological, political, or religious. We demand the demilitarization of the police, politics, and social life. We demand the advancement for public policy, civil and social rights. Finally, about the provocation that inspired this event, what next in Brazil? If I have to answer this question based on the Brazilian voices of peripheries, what comes next is the same as ours: resistance and fight. Fight for to ensure that the denounce of the black and the peripheral of extermination will not be put in hold, or the extreme violence suffered by people fighting for land rights in rural areas, as indigenous people and members of the land works movement. Those struggles and many others carried by the most diverse social movements need to be in the base of the democracy we want and need. Thank you. Okay.
That's fine. All right. Thank you, Ramon. Thank you, Hanan, Gary, Zuza, and Sylvia, and for all here at Brown to be back. It's awesome to be back. First, want to apologize that this will be a fast-paced presentation. I have a lot to say. I might not get to the end of it, so I just want to first say that it has two parts, two lessons, two things I think we can learn about this mess that's going on. First about the coup, and second some institutional reflections, some reflections about smaller details that I think might be improved in Brazil. So I am a lawyer, I am a constitutional lawyer. I know law is boring for many people, so I'm trying to make it, I have the bitter task of making it easier for you guys. So let's begin with the basics. Impeachment without an impeachable offense, what in Brazilian law is called crime de responsabilidade, is a coup. Good news, guys, there won't be a coup. I beg to disagree with my co-panelists here, but from the legal standpoint, listen, the impeachment might be a terrible thing, politically, but from a legal standpoint, there's no reason to be calling it a coup. If you call it a coup, you're agreeing to the government rhetoric. That's fine if you want to support the government. Just don't shift what is a technical thing to a political discourse. So why I say that this is not a coup? Well, impeachment process, as many Americans know, you have it here, is a political process, not a legal process. Dilma is not being accused, is not being charged to rob a bank. She would never do it, right? So this is not a common crime. If it were a common crime, Dilma would be charged under the Supreme Federal Court, under the provision in Article 102, I don't know even why I put it, but it's a completely different procedure. And what is the point of being a different procedure? Well, evidentiary standards are completely different. You don't inquire for specific intent, or what in Portuguese we call it dolo, or culpa, or recklessness, negligence. These discussions are relaxed, are not the center of discussion in the impeachment process. They are in the common crimes prosecution. So this is why, funny thing, I don't think I have the time to say this, but I will now. Collor, do you remember Collor? He was impeached in '92. Well, he was acquitted in his common criminal charges in the Supreme Federal Court. Why? No evidentiary standards for this. But as impeachment was a political process, he was impeached. And I think no one here would say that we have to say, sorry, Collor, here's your ticket back, please take the chair. We are very sorry we made a coup against you. So I think that's kind of ridiculous, right? So you gotta understand that the political impeachment process is completely different from the legal common crime prosecution process. But the impeachment process is political with the legal trigger. So I have the trigger warning for bad jokes, right? You got him. I'm warning you guys. So first of all, the legal trigger. In this case, what is the legal trigger? Well, the Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, says that impeachable offenses are acts that violate the Constitution, especially against Section 6, the budgetary law. I could even include Section 5 that says unprobity actions, meaning that Dilma would also be impeachable under Section 5, but it's a very contested thing. It's not what's being argued there. So I won't even bring this to the table, but I'll keep to the point that's being discussed in the Congress, which is the budgetary law, in what is being called pedaladas fiscais, or in English, fiscal backpedaling. I'm not talking about this backpedaling. Many people say that backpedaling means this, like the bike pedaling. I want to argue that it means this, right? it's a shifty, it's a maneuver to trick you, to make something that you should, I mean, say you're going there, but you're going there, and then you end up getting a penalty kick. But, all right, talking seriously, what is a fiscal backpedaling? First, you gotta say that in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, Brazil had a very serious problem with inflation, with public debt, public spending, not only from the union, for the federal government, but also from states. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was passed under the Fernando Henrique government, the Dilma, right? So it helped making a stable government, stable economic situation for the governments of the Workers' Party. And this Fiscal Responsibility Act and the Statute 1079, which is the statute that talks about the impeachable offenses, they forbid federative entities, not only the federal government, but also states and counties, to make credit operations with financial institutions controlled by that entity. What are those financial institutions? We usually, all right, I'm sorry, and an example when that's the case with Dilma of a credit operation would be to take a loan with the controlled financial operation and not repaid unduly with another method that's not under the budgetary law. So when we talk about financial institutions controlled by the state, we usually think about these three, right? BNDES, Banco do Brasil, Caixa. In the case, Dilma's case, I guess the operations were made with Caixa. But we also got to remember that in the 90s, each state had a bank. So, Banespa, Banrisul, BRB, Banco da Amazônia, Banco do Nordeste, Banerj. Banerj, by the way, I don't know if you remember him, but Banerj used to sponsor this guy. So, I mean, money from the people of the state of Rio de Janeiro going to Sena? All right. I mean, so what happened in the 90s? States use public banks' money to pay their payroll, their officers, and build bridges, build bikeways that didn't fall off the ground. So that created a serious debt problem that was dealt with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So that's the whole point of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It's trying to constrain governors and the president to not spend too much. All right, so yeah, Dilma took credit operations to pay for social programs. Yeah, she did it. But then the government says, well, she didn't do it. That's not what the Federal Accounts Court, TCU, found. For the first time since 1937, TCU rejected. TCU is has the jurisdiction to do that, is the proper organ in the Brazilian structure to do that. So whatever, the institution that had to deal with it, dealt with it and said that Dilma in 2014 did that, and she did again the same thing in 2015. So the Accounts Court said that gave a red warning to a red sign to Dilma in 2014, but she didn't care. So the second argument for the government is, all right, everyone else did it, right? So all the governors, mayors, Lula did it, and Fernando Henrique did it, Cabral did it, everyone did it, right? Well, again, that's not quite the truth, right? I mean, you have like fluctuations in Lula years, but I mean, if you look at the graphic, it's kind of telling, right? So 2013, 14, and even 15, yeah, she really backpedaled. I mean, that's that might not be like a crime like robbing a bank or murdering someone, but the Brazilian constitutional order doesn't allow her to do that. I mean, calling that a coup is like a bit misleading. And also, again, Dilma argues that state governors, mayors do that. We got to remember that most state banks were privatized, so they cannot do that. They can't even do that because states don't have a financial institution to backpedal anymore, right? So yeah, that's not a good argument either. So, all right, coup aside or not coup aside, I want to, in my final minutes, bring some institutional remarks about what other lessons can we learn, what are the problems, the main problems we're facing here, and how can we address them. So, first, I guess, mentioned Eduardo Cunha, and it's a really big problem that the House Speaker has too much power in his hands. I mean, I don't know how other speakers didn't do what he's doing, like took advantage of it. But the point is that the bylaws in Congress allow him to do all the maneuvers, the tricks that he's doing. It's all legal, guys. Sorry. So when you take a guy with this approach and you get him and you don't put constraints on him, he will do whatever he wants, and that's what he's doing, right? So it's sad. It's completely sad. I don't like him. I hate him. But I mean, we have to find ways of constraining the power of the House leader. It might be Cunha this time. Might be someone else next time. It's not the person. It's the institution. It's the way the institution is working that's problematic. So I'm not supporting Cunha or anything. Just telling that we have this problem, right? So second problem, judicial power in Brazil is chaotic, it's very activist. You get this from injunctions flowing around, like flooding. We have flood of injunctions. Just remember when Dilma appointed Lula to be her chief of staff, like 32 lawsuits and federal courts to declare it void. So it's really problematic that courts in Brazil don't speak to each other. And this is led by, of course, by our Supreme Court. 11 elected judges that control the life of the country. Americans might resemble this sentence, right? So we have a huge problem with these 11 guys. They are a black box. They are being deferent now so far to the Senate, to the Congress in the impeachment process. They're not meddling too much. They're controlling the procedure, which is their duty to do, to make sure that due process of law is being secure, to make sure that the government, that Dilma, has all the opportunity to be heard and to present their defense through the AGU, through the state attorney, through the attorney general, sorry. But the Supreme Court so far has not put his hands in the dirty part, has not tried to get into the merits of the procedure, which is not the court's job, right? This is not a criminal procedure. This is a political, which the Constitution says that first the House and then the Senate must decide. So if the court starts deciding on the merits of the impeachment, I think this is a coup by the court, right? But this is a very, very problematic thing for a constitutional lawyer to say that the court is making a coup, right? So how can you say that that the court's decision should not be followed in case the court goes on and decides on the merits? Well, yeah, it's not on the court's jurisdiction to do that, but what to do in the case it does. So it's a it's a problem that it might happen, might not. We'll only know if it happens. And the third and last point is the political system, right? Renan touched on the point that, I mean, PT like made worse the fragmentation, which is my first point. And we have almost 40 parties, 37 parties in Congress, and it's really hard to do with that. So some proposals, putting a threshold, like many proportional systems. Well, Supreme Court has struck down a statute that tried to put a threshold, so we have to pass an amendment to do that. A second, a mixed member proportional representation like Germany, yeah, their year came up, but might be difficult. Also, we have now a different campaign finance system. Used to be private, but now will be a public one. But I'm not sure whether this will make any difference. Honestly, I'm not sure. It might. I hope it might, right? And last but not least, recall. I'm a very, very big fan of recall, right? I think that part of this problem is that we don't have recall system, right? The impeachment is our escape valve. If we had a recall system, then things will be different. But again, not everything is perfect, and recall also has its problems, as Californians might know. All right, thank you.
We have, I think, about 45 minutes, at least, yeah, for discussion. And rather than throw it back to the panelists to say anything or to rebut or address each other, I want to throw it straight to the audience for comments and questions. What I'd just like to ask you to do is try to have one question apiece, rather than I have 5 questions. The following are there. That way we get to do more people. And also, if you need, and sometimes this is necessary, to contextualize your question first, could you make it concise? Yes.
I might be mistaken, but I think there was something like wrong in Andrea's slides. Please correct me if I'm mistaken. But the TCU actually rejected, the decision by the TCU rejecting the accounts of Dilma was taken in the end of 2015, right? October. So it's not true to say that they decided that backpedaling was illegal and that Dilma did it again anyway. And actually, the TCU in previous years had not rejected accounts by FHR or Lula, even though they did backpedal to a lesser extent, it's true, but they did backpedal as well. So wasn't Dilma up to that point acting in accordance with previous legal understanding of what would not be in breach of the fiscal responsibility law in Brazil?
Well, the slide said that, I won't be able to put it, but it said that TCU decision was related to 2014, right? But she did it again on 2015. I couldn't find the graph with the numbers, but she did it.
Yeah, but the decision was taken in 2015.
Yeah, related to the accounts of 2014.
Yes,
Yes.
but you said the TCU had taken the decision and then Dilma didn't care and did it again.
Yeah, she did it again in 2015.
No, it's not true.
No, 2016.
Yeah, 2016.
Yeah. She continued to do that after TCU decision. Sorry for the years, but the point is that she continued to do that. She continued to do that, even and this TCU decision was a landmark decision because TCU never, ever allowed for a defendant to argue with so long a time as TCU allowed Dilma to present her defense. Like, what I'm doing is under the law. This decision took almost a year, maybe more than that, to be brought up because they were trying to understand that this is very serious, and we're gonna reject your accounts because it's a huge number and what's going on. So, going to second part of your question, Lula, the difference between Lula, Fernando Henrique, and Dilma. Well, in law, there's this thing called distinguishing. Well, if I say that vehicles are not allowed in the park, and I come with a bike and you come with a tank, there are two vehicles, but one is a tank, the other is a bike. I mean, you gotta understand the difference of proportion when the court, the accounts court said, well, if you just let the fluctuation go up and down, and then if you got a month that you're not doing that, and the next month then you repay that, that's fine. But if you systematically use that as a mechanism or trying to make the budget, make the federal government's accounts look better than they do, then this is a violation of the fiscal responsibility law. That's the whole point of the law. Sure.
Cut the
Sure,
answer
sorry,
a
sorry.
bit so that, no, not sorry. We may come back to it, but I just want to make sure that we cover a range of questions. Okay, I'll just go this way.
Okay, so for those that said that there is a coup, so if there's no legal basis, right, for saying there is a coup, and also all the polls have shown that the population supports the impeachment, both across classes, right? So Lata Pugar came up with a poll that said in all classes, over 60% of the population approves impeachment. It's just that their reasons for why they want impeachment changes across classes. Then why is it that you still say that there is a coup there, right? And even Maria, right, that they became so famous, on that same interview that she gave that quote, she said that she also supported impeachment, right? So I just wanted to talk about if it's a class problem, right? If it's this dichotomy, then why do the states still support it?
No, only I didn't say that in my opinion it was a coup. I said that the group I was presented was saying that it was a coup. Now I will say my opinion, I think it is a coup. So to clarify debate. And about the question, I think that we must look at the process and think about what kind of opinion is mobilized when people ask, do you want impeachment, and the answer and the polls, the methodology of the polls, and also what kind of information people has in their response. I don't think that the poll is exactly people are addressing the idea of impeachment in the same way it is discussed in the Congress. I think it's different for starts. And what I think is there is no legal basis for the impeachment, although André told us there is a legal basis. Also, for example, André said that the states there has no banks, public banks, but how we can explain, for example, Alckmin does, the governor of São Paulo does pedaladas with the Nota Fiscal Paulista. I have no idea how to translate that, but he does pedaladas using this money, the credit of notas fiscais, and for me, it's the same process. It's the same way, and this the same thing. And how you think about accountability if you judge not judge, but in a political process, we agree that it is something that she should be impeachment. By that, how you think about the states, the accountability, and how it will work, for example. But it is a question for you.
The two of them reply to his question, and then you can reply to her question to you. So if you would reply to his question.
Well, I really said it is a coup, because I think it is. I disagree of the opinion of André. I think that in law we law is interpretation basically, but we have obviously some legal framework that is important to consider. And for me, it's not being respected, and that's why I took like a passive point that I was not going to discuss the law because it's not being discussed in this process. If you see all the voters and the justifications that they use it in the chamber, you're gonna see that it's not important, the law, the crime of liability, and this is not in the report of the reporter about the crime. So you don't have this minimum respect of the legal framework. I could say, for example, that this law that André mentioned here of the impeachment, it says clearly that operação de crédito, and the TCU said that what they identified in Dilma's procedures, these pedaladas, was similar to operações de crédito, but they don't say that it's operações de crédito, this procedure. And if we discuss like the crime, the crime, you have to have like a typicity very strictly. You don't have a crime if it's not like seen as this before of the conduct. So if you don't have this defined before, and the Dilma don't know that she's doing something that it's a crime because everybody did until then, and I don't like this kind of procedure. I think that we can improve it, and I'm very happy that the TCU changed their understanding about this question, but I think that it has to apply from now the decision to the next president. You don't like do it in the occasion and do an impeachment like in the occasion, because this is a coup, because you are not treating the same way the people that do the same things. Another question is that I don't think that you have to distinguish. If you kill one person or if you kill 10 people, you like committed a crime. Yeah, it doesn't matter how many people. Yeah, it matters like to see how many years you are going to be in jail, but it's a crime in the same way. So it's you don't distinguish this like it's almost a crime or it's a crime. No, it's a crime, but it's this way or that way. But I don't think that this dimension of the process it's fundamental. And the other question is that we are talking about the counts of 2014. It was in the first mandate of Dilma, and the TCU reproved these counts. But my understanding is that you cannot impeach this mandate, the second mandate of Dilma, because of factors committed in the first one. She's still doing that. I don't know. The TCU has to analyze the counts, and then this count has to be judged by the Congress, something that didn't happen even with the 2014 count also. So I think that the discussion is a little bit more complex in this sense of the juridical terms, but as I said, I don't want to discuss it because I don't think it's the fundamental question in the current political situation that was the subject of the roundtable.
Since the replies also addressed Andre, we give Andre a moment of, how shall
All
we
right,
call it?
thank
Not
you, Jerry.
rebuttal, but
All right,
addition,
yeah.
and then take
Just-
another question.
Just to make it clear, TCU's decision was about the accounts of 2014. It was decided on mid-2015, and she again did it. So in 2015, the process, the process was filed in Congress by Janaína Pascoal. Deals, they deal with the 2015 pedaladas, with the crime, with the act that was considered a crime under the 2014 decision. Second point, you don't even need a TCU decision stating that that specific sheet of paper with that specific signature represents a crime. I mean, Collor was impeached by what? Right? You don't have the point of saying that the impeachment process is a political process, not a legal process, is that you don't need to discuss intention. You don't need to discuss evidence as strictly as you need dolo, culpa, and evidence about the crime, the typicity of the crime, as you do need in a regular shoplifting, murder, or whatever corruption process, criminal process. So the point I try to make on my last slide, that we need a recall, we need another escape valve. The impeachment is too traumatic escape valve, right? But that's the only one we have. So unfortunately, she did it. She did.
Do you think that impeachment is the same as recall? So for Brazil nowadays, like
We end up using the impeachment because we don't have a recall, right? If we had a recall and she had 7% of approval, she would say, and the recall got in, she would probably be thrown out of office by recall, which I think is a way better option, but unfortunately we don't. And just to address her point, her point, if this whole process raises awareness of fiscal responsibility and making the law prevail, I'm all for it. You can impeach, the states can impeach all governments and mayors. I'm all for it. I'm all for making the law count.
Okay, let's move from this theme to perhaps another theme. I'm going to take them as they go around the room, so I'll do her and then you.
Yeah, my question was about the viewpoint of the peripheries. I did my dissertation research. I lived in a favela in Rio, Complexo do Alemão. I lived there for over a year. What I found when I was doing my research was that the activist perspectives in the favela are, while they're, I admire those courageous voices very much, they're not often like what the ordinary person really thinks or believes as much as I would want them to have the activist perspective, right? And there's a lot of times a really big disjuncture. And what I found was that the people who, like the kind of ordinary people who aren't doing activism, they like to believe, they like to have someone to blame politically for all of the inequalities that they suffer. That's kind of a big way that people have of articulating injustice, is to point fingers sometimes. And so it seems like the case against Dilma might actually have some traction, and I haven't been there at all since the time, so I'm actually just really curious what you've observed about that distinction.
Okay. I thought it would be a question, because, yes. What I tried to do was, when I brought the story of Maria Angelica, and after that I talked about the movement. I was trying exactly to do this kind of work on separate the leadership from what we can think about common people. Because when we are talking about other movements and in other sectors, we don't really do this kind of distinction. Normally, when we are talking about middle class, we talk about middle class as a homogeneous group. But there are leaders, and there is people who speak by everybody. But every time when we are talking about periphery, there is this idea, oh, nobody knows. It is like something that nobody knows and nobody can speak for them. Now there are people who are saying, I can speak for these people because I'm from this place, I'm from the periphery, and I can be a leader here. We need to look at that. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but we need to look at that and think that the change in Brazil can be there in some way. I'm also from a periphery, not of Rio, but in Salvador. And what I can say is there is a lot of understanding about what's going on, because everybody is like, without know what's going on, but also there is a lot of criticism and disbelief, not only in politics, but also in the media, because they know that the way they are portrayed in the media is not the same way they are. So people sometimes think that in periphery, there are not thoughts, there are not criticism, they don't know what's going on, they are living like without any idea of the reality, and they have their idea of the reality, and we need to put that idea into the debate. I think there is some strong discontentment with the government, but also this thought that who are different from that. I think to address the comment about Maria Angelica agreeing with the impeachment, we need to put in context that his chef for
boss.
Oh, yes, it's great to have a Portuguese speak. Okay, her boss, he is pro-impeachment. Did you see what happened in Brazil? And a lot of information we see that people are asking their domestic workers for WhatsApp. Oh, by the way, do you support Dilma? Because if you do support Dilma, you're not invited for my house anymore. This kind of thing happens. We need to put in context. She can't have her thought about the government, but also when she says it will not change, she's saying something very strong. I can't support impeachment, but who is different? And I think it's the strong voice who came from the periphery. Like we need work to have to the change. We need work to the change.
Okay. You had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, I was recently in Brazil and I spoke to a woman there about the impeachment. And she said, like, as a black woman living in extreme poverty in Salvador, she described it amidst the stilts and the chaos. She described herself as a survivor. And when are we going to really discuss the real issue here, which is structural oppression and marginalization of a people, right? As opposed to the high politics in Brazil. That, to me, doesn't really seem like the issue. This woman is a survivor. She's a mother, she's a black woman, and she's grown up in extreme poverty. To me, I find that very, very touching. And I think it's really irrelevant and insignificant to be discussing fiscal responsibility when you have something as serious as this going on in Brazil.
Okay, that's an observation, not a question, and which is fine. So the panelists can respond to your observation.
I also want to know what's your perspective on that. About the comment about that, because I know you know Brazil a lot. You are in Brazil last month in Bahia, so.
Next week. The job of moderator is not to put your own, or else then the panelists will feel that maybe I can't say it, or even the audience might feel like maybe I can't say it. But I think that, so I'll go ahead and say it. I think that this discussion that we're having is very important. I don't think it's right to say that one aspect or the other is negligible and doesn't count. I think, and I'm not Brazilian, but I think for Brazilians, the entire state of the political system and the political institutions in the country, it's important to discuss any aspect of that. That said, I would fall on the side of something that Edilza said in her presentation, which is there's an underlying set of things that are critically important to the future of Brazil. These other things, it's not that they're unimportant, but there's an underlying tension, there's an underlying fracture, there's an underlying set of tensions, which, as you can see from some of the images that she showed and that I showed, they didn't pop up today. This isn't a CNN moment. It isn't even a Dilma moment. It isn't even a Lula or a Collor or any other moment. Some of these things are historical basis of structural problems in Brazil. And I think if I understood Adilza right, what she was saying is there's an opportunity, or maybe it's just an imperative now, to pay attention to those underlying questions, which doesn't mean you say, well, it doesn't matter what goes on in Parliament, or I don't care what the Brazilian law says, or I'm not interested in the political discussions. I don't think that I wouldn't hold that position. But I think there is this question of priorities. So which of these things is really at the underlying base of the problem? Does that make sense?
Well, she also said
And I'm not going to do you and me in a dialogue. I'm
corruption
going
has
to
existed
get
for
some other
500
questions.
years, is what she said too. And I imagine that the majority of that corruption has stemmed from the political elite class, which I imagine is also largely white. So, I mean, 500 years of corruption, and now it's
Well,
important.
500 years of corruption.
I'm
that's-
just saying what she said.
You know what you mean. We know what you mean, institutionally and long-term. I'm from the United States, you can say the same thing. That doesn't make it valid or more valid or less valid, but I'm just saying, problems like these, and this is a university, so at the university you have an opportunity to go deep and go long. You don't wake up to CNN moments, no, you really can look back through the underlying bases for national problems, for a society's institutionalized problems. And I think that's what Adilza was pointing out. Okay, that's enough of me, yes?
Thank you, Larry.
Question. Other questions or comments? I went this way, through the middle.
No, I'm just smiling because your comments were great.
Can I just address one point of his
Please,
comment?
push back, Andre.
That's not a pushback. It's just that institutions matter. You're American, right? No.
No.
UK, okay. So even better, because you don't even have a constitution, a written constitution, but you have the most stable legal system in the world, right? So stability is important for institution, for economic development. So do you know who's suffering the most with the current crisis, with the current unemployment, with the current inflation? You might not know, but we had a very, very big problem with inflation and economic instability in the 90s. So do you know who suffered the most with it? The poor, right? So there is a saying that inflation is taxation without legislation, right? So the poor had very big problems with the mid class, the upper class. They had their investments. They survived the 80s and 90s without the problem. So we have a political and an economical crisis going on. Both they have their roots in the similar questions, but they're different. But the institutional aspect also helps understanding the economic part of the problem. And the economic part of the Dilma's first and second mandate, also helps understanding the huge insatisfaction with her second term. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you just dismiss the institutional analysis, you might looking for a small problem here or a medium problem here, but you might be not willing to discuss the things that might help solve the problems you're looking.
Okay. I'll come to you. More questions, comments from anyone who has not spoken so far? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about your arguments, your position in calling the political movement for the impeachment as a coup, as something besides legality. It wasn't clear for me exactly why you argue that, because the trial didn't start yet. The trial is going to start when the Senate begins its part. The report was it was limited by the way the head of the House of Representatives accepted the document, and people at the House, the congressmen at the House of Representatives didn't need to justify their votes. They just had to vote. Their job there was just to vote. So exactly where is the illegality in the trial?
I have spent these last 2 weeks in Brazil, and that's why I'm really pessimistic about the situation and very sad, deeply sad about the situation in Brazil. And for me, I think that we have had the coup. I think that it's done. We don't have more government, and even if you have a government, Dilma, it's going to be worse, doing worse and worse than we had before. That it was really bad and very bad government. But we're going to have like the impeachment as an instrument of more space and more empowerment of the conservative sectors of the Brazilian society. So for me, it's done. That's why for me, it's a coup. Maybe I'm wrong, and I will be very happy if tomorrow the Senate vote and say, no, it's not a crime of liability, and Dilma she's going to stay and maintain the mandate. But I think it's not going to happen. Or even if this happens, André talked about this activism of the Brazilian judiciary. But many people are arguing that the Supreme Court has this power and even the due to judge this and see if you have this compatibility between the allegations of crime of liability and the conduct of Dilma. It's not. It's a political process, but you have a legal framework that the Supreme Court can like see if it fits, if you have like a crime in this sense. So I think that this is gonna happen, this discussion, but I really think that it's done. And for me, it's a coup because I'm not saying that people are saying, Dilma has fora Dilma. Fora Dilma is okay. You can say that. You can, but in the moment that it happens, like the admission of this, the acceptance of this process in the chamber, and it started, and you don't have like the evidences for the crime, and I disagree that you don't have to have this in an impeachment because this is not recall. If it was recall, I would agree with André, and that's okay. But we don't have. I would like to have this also. I think we can fight to have this for the next presidents, but not for now again, because I don't think you can change the rules during the game. But for me, it's a coup because you don't have the legal basis for this procedure. And for me, it's very clear that when there are many people paying for these protests and these demonstrations, and the media is like every day doing a kind of convocating people and to go to the streets and you have the judiciary leaking informations of very important investigations, and this is something for me that it's not democratic, that you are not in according with the rule of law. And for me, this configures a coup, not in the traditional sense of the term in Latin America with military people on the streets, but for me, it's a coup. When you empower the opposition that lost the last election 2 years ago, they are not chosen. And they are now, they are part, you see the newspapers today, yesterday, that now PSDB is part of the government Temer. And you have a government, you have a minister. I know who's going to be the minister of Saúde, of Fazenda. So I don't know how to call this except as a coup.
Okay. Oh, more hands now. Okay, so the lady, and then Ben, and then the other lady, or no, lady, Ben, the gentleman, and then finally. You got that? Okay.
So this is a question about sort of what will happen next and why. It might be something that I'm not knowledgeable about. So it's a genuine question around like alfinetada to anyone. Brazil has this coalition government, right? So there's the PT with the PMDB, and some of you have described this relationship. So why is it that Temer seems like he's going just to be in power and is already doing all these deals with the opposition parties, and it seems like people are not really questioning his legitimacy as much, right? So like, I think part of, just as a spectator of the process that's been going on, what is clear, like aside from these technical discussions of whether Dilma has a legal basis or not to be impeached, is that there's this overall discourse that this is a crusade against corruption, yet it stops at Dilma. Like that's it, right? Like as soon as she's gone, like people seem to be, and I mean people as in like my Facebook feed seems to be like happy about it, right? Or there seems to be this perception that as soon as she's out, things are gonna get better, and it seems like Temer isn't going anywhere. There are people who have the illusion that like after Dilma falls, that they will take everyone else out, including Eduardo Cunha and Temer and whoever else, but it really doesn't seem like it's moving in that way. So why is it the PMDB doesn't have responsibility? It doesn't seem to be accountable to the same issues that the PT is accountable for?
Andre? I might be an optimistic here because
I think that, all right, so let's say Dilma is impeached and removed. First thing, next day, PT supporters will be on the streets claiming for Temer's head, for Renan's head, for Cunha's head, for everyone's head, right? So that's how politics work. I'm definitely not a supporter of the Workers' Party government, but I will be with them. Like, okay, now it's Temer, now it's Cunha, now it's ever. You think that, okay, this is not the way it might be going. So again, this is another point for reinforcing institutions, reinforcing the federal police, reinforcing the state attorney, and making the Supreme Court, shielding the Supreme Court from political influence. So if you have institutions working, which I think so far they've worked, then you're gonna get them from the outside. As my point about Cunha, I tried to say that his peers are not gonna take him off there, the chair. You have, unfortunately in Brazil, you gotta have someone from the outside take them. So this is why I think that we gotta stay on the street, support the institutions that are making things work.
No, I really don't know. I think that for agreeing with André seems not possible, but yes, in this point. But I have some doubts about that thing of institutions working, because we need to think that a big deal of the federal police working, for example, was PT action today have some independence from the government. It was very different before. So how we can think that these people so involved in corruption, they will work to the institutions work. So I don't know. I'm not in a positive mind about Brazil, because I think that when they have access to the power, they will ensure that nothing else will happen to prosecute, to make people be judged and be put away. If you think about Temer, for example, today in my timeline in Facebook, people were sharing a video of Temer saying, "Oh, I trust in Eduardo Cunha. He is my man in the Congress, and he does what nobody is able to do." He's saying that. Last week, he told to some journalists in the, I think, New York Times, I not agree with their persecution of Eduardo Cunha. So, I don't know. I don't think we have, and we need to think about the neoliberal program Cunha has. Sorry, it's not what's Cunha. Temer has, and everybody's agreeing with that. I went to the graduate school in the same school that Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So when I was preparing to come here, I started to follow my former professors because they are very supportive of Fernando Henrique and PSDB. And a professor that I had, he is very right-wing and very supportive of PSDB. He said, there is no doubt it will be a new liberal project. And he was like, we need that, but.
O Marcos Nobre has a thesis about PMDBismo in a book called Imobilismo em Movimento. He says that PMDBismo not as like PMDB only the party, but as a political culture in the Brazilian politics that was built since the redemocratization at least, and it's a kind of protection of the political system to these efforts and these mobilizations of the streets, of the social movements, and a way of accommodating and neutralizing these pressures, these popular pressures on the political system. And he says, like many characteristics of this PMDBismo, like governismo, that PMDB is always like close to the government, and it's very clear in this period, like since '85. They always they always are supporting it, but they don't. And I think that's the point for your question. They don't like assume, or they are not in the front line. You don't like attribute to them the problems of the government. And I think that they are very good as they are a very big party and with many differences inside it. They can say like they can be in everywhere, every time, and in every question and agenda in Brazil. There are people saying like Pedro Simon or neoliberal like another, or Eduardo Cunha with the religious people, or they can like they have that capacity of adapting, and that's why I think that they are not being linked. I think that Temer, like Serra and other politicians from Brazil, like Dilma, also don't have the capacity of I don't know, mobilizing people and feelings in people, and I think that's why people don't like him, because we don't have elements to don't like him. We don't know like what Temer did. He was like a very important political, but doing not this frontline job. Like, so I don't know what's gonna happen in this sense. Just to finish. But I think it's a government without legitimacy. Like my position is like I don't recognize a government started like by a coup. It doesn't represent nothing because it's my opinion. But I think that we have to build these alternatives for 2018 and after this.
How are we doing on the time?
We have some time.
Okay.
We can go like maybe about 10 more minutes.
10 more. Okay, so that means you divide up what you're going to say and ask. We're going to do Ben.
She can go.
No, I want her to be last. I have my reasons. Ben, then you, then her. And that'll be it, I think. Yes.
All right, here's as abridged a version of this as I can do. So I think that there is a lot of, what we've heard from tonight is there's going to be a lot of suspicion of the PMDB government with figures like Cunha and Terme involved and other people who are currently under.
Excuse me, hold on just a moment. I may be being unfair to the audience that is not Brazilian, because this is being live streamed, and we've used lots of things, TUC, and so forth and so on, which to the broader live stream audience out there might not be immediately intelligible. So if you mention a party, say that it's a party. If you're mentioning a person, say, member of parliament or whatever. I should have said this long ago. And if you're saying TUC, say that it is the Supreme Court or something, so that the non-Brazilian audience who is listening or in the room or out of the room can follow better. Sorry.
No problem. So having the PMDB party and Speaker Cunha and Vice President Temer being under a lot of suspicion by a large portion of the population, also the PT, the Workers' Party establishment, under a lot of suspicion by another large portion of the population, is there also the option that where we go forward is, I don't want to say a level playing field, but a playing field where all the big players really are out of the game? And what could happen, and what do you think should happen
One
in that
question,
kind of situation?
one man, one question.
There we go.
Which one do you want them to answer?
So what could happen? do you see, no, the initial part, do you see there being like kind of a potential leveled playing field as a solution of this?
Okay, this is such a great ending question. If you don't mind, I'm gonna have them write it down, and we'll take the other two questions, and then whichever one you feel you want to address as your terminal remarks, we'll do that, okay? So we're gonna combine that question with those two, and your reply will also do that, and your replies are gonna be synthetic, okay? Yes, so now it doesn't matter you first, her first.
So during this whole process, and as we've seen, there's been a huge polarization between people, right? You're either in one camp or the other, there's nothing in between. And if you say anything in favor of something that one camp believes, then you already denies everything else that the other one says, right? So if you say, oh, I'm in favor of the impeachment, then you must be in favor of Cunha being in power, right? So there's this dichotomy that doesn't make any sense, but it's being played out like crazy in the media, between acquaintances. So I just wanted to hear what you have to say about what does this do to the whole process, and whether you're going to continue to see this, and what is the effect of that for what's going on.
Okay, I think that also falls nicely in what next, Senora.
My question is more specific, actually. It was mentioned that you studied philosophy, so I'm trying to understand your line of thought and your argument. When you were talking about Cunha and about it being problematic, that he was there, but the power was so concentrated in his figure, but that we have to stop focusing on his personality and try to work that out afterwards, because the problem is the institution. Couldn't this argument be used, couldn't the same argument be used for Dilma? Couldn't you say that, especially in the context that Cunha is so involved and so clearly involved with corruption, and it's such an irony that he's the one leading this process? Couldn't you say that the problem is the way power is distributed in Brazil and the way the political system is systematized, and also tying this to color, when you said that many people here wouldn't want to give him back his ticket, you were comparing the situations, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you were saying is that a big part of the claim that this is a coup is ideological. I mean, isn't the whole process, you were talking in the beginning of the presentation about how this is a political process, and how you have to separate the technicalities from the political thing. Can you really do that? And isn't ideology part of politics? And can we really ignore all of the political components of this political process if it's a political process?
All right, wait. Hold on. With your permission, con permiso, I'm going to take all three questions, torturing and mangling various parts, to get to one broad question that I will ask each of the panelists to address, and that's their final remarks, and to be as synthetic as you can. And I just want to pay tribute to, if I had to speak in my second language, I could not be as crisp and articulate as all of you have been. So, I'm not trying to push you or rush you. I understand what it is to try to think through another language and then, thinking this way and it's coming out of your mouth another way. So we're going to use kind of a bit of a license in understanding that, but I'm asking you to be synthetic. So as the final question, synthetic probably isn't even used like that in English, is it? Doesn't matter. The final question is, I think people are asking what next for the political system and what next for politics, which is not necessarily the same thing in Brazil. And with that, you can address some of the underlying notes of the last three questions if you wish. But the overarching question will end where we started. It's what next, Brazil, and you'll do that. What next? So let me start with Andre, and we'll just come this way. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for all three. I will try to do a 3-in-1. The point of saying that I don't think it's possible to put into completely different boxes, the legal and political. The point that I try to make is that please, as Renan did, please put in the political terms. I'm saying this is politically a bad move. This is politically an aggressive move. This government doesn't have legitimacy. I will agree completely with everyone who says that. But the term coup has a legal connotation that I try to show that it's not what's in play here. Regarding the two other points, I agree with Ben. I think I hope that there will be a level playing field thing going on as Lava Jato goes forward. Many of the old caciques will fall, hopefully. And the good thing, and the thing I'm optimistic about, is that in Brazil, politics will be more ideological and less opportunistic in the future. I think that the new generations are gonna align themselves in more ideological lines than the past generations that did that in order to survive the redemocratization. So I think we end up in a high note saying that, okay, it will happen, there will be a general reshuffle, but in the end, I think parties as PSOL or Novo and the other end will end up gathering support from people who now don't have a party to align with.
It is.
I think that is something very important we didn't address here today, that the evangelical power and the politics in Brazil. I think that probably my projection is that the evangelical group may be the next very popular political group in Brazil. Now it's hard to see because they are very divided. Some of the groups were supporting the government, some were against the government, but now they are all together and they can build something else. I think there's some possibility to the left build also a strong opposition to the government that is probably will happen, but also they will have a lot of problems, and if they can talk with people, if they can approach people, if they can talk with the masses, it is a problem. And I have to say that it is a problem to PSOL, for example, and for other left parties. So I think there is a lot to do, a lot of work to do, and we need to pay attention to the evangelical. I think it is not our problem to the evangelical representatives. Benedita da Silva, for example, is a strong evangelical representative. Marina Silva also. But they can see a moment to be together and came strong with a platform. So what do you do? Because it will be a very conservative platform. You can appeal to the masses, but what will happen with the citizenship, the agenda that Brazil has today, with all the problems? So we need to think about that. And thank you.
I think as I said, I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and I think that we're gonna have like 2 years of a very difficult moment in Brazil, and because the economic crisis is gonna continue, and I think it's gonna become worse, even worse. And the political crisis also, I think that we are gonna have like some stability because this government like is being structured and organized with all the parties except the PT, PCdoB, and PSOL. All the others is gonna be inside, and they are going to give this support to the government. So it's gonna work. I think they're gonna have the majority more than the Dilma government. Since 2010, but I think that you're gonna have also to some way remember of these mass mobilizations of 2013 and what like the message of it, and I think that's gonna be important to the resistance of this project, because I think that's gonna be a very neoliberal project that we some way opposed in the election, in the second turn, but I think that now it's gonna like achieve the power. So for me, in resume, I think that it's not the end of the world, but it's a coup.
And on that note, I would like you to join me in thanking the panelists for a very stimulating and provocative debate. And maybe we will convene again in the fall for Brazil. What next? Thank you.